Imagine for a moment that you're standing before a rusted iron door, locked for nearly 2 decades, and on the other side you hear shallow breaths, small, muffled by darkness. Now imagine that when this door finally opens, 23 pairs of eyes look at you as if daylight were a foreign language they never learned to read. This isn't a made-up story to scare you. This happened in March 1864, when Union soldiers broke down the doors of a farm south of Waynesboro and discovered something no history book has been able to fully explain to this day. What they found in that cellar wasn't just children forgotten by time. It was a secret so deep that by the time you finish hearing the story, you'll understand why some truths are more terrifying than any fiction. When the soldiers finally forced the rusted hinges and torchlight flooded that cold, damp space, what they saw would forever change the way they looked at the war. 23 children, some only 4 or 5 years old, others approaching adolescence, all crammed into that dark cellar, bare feet on the wet floor that reeked of earth mixed with fear and frozen time. But there was something more disturbing than the number of children or the condition they were in. There was something about their faces, a sad nobility, delicate, as if they'd been torn from an old painting and thrown there into oblivion. High cheekbones, delicate noses, an invisible refinement that showed in the way they shrank from the light, as if they were used to taking up the smallest space possible. And when the sergeant asked who they were and why they were there, the answer he got from the oldest girl was as cryptic as it was chilling. She, a 13-year-old girl with a worn scarf tied around her wrist like a precious jewel, raised her chin with a dignity that shouldn't have existed in that place, and said only, "We are his legacy." Then she pointed upward, not at a man, at an entire house. Have you ever stopped to think what it means to be called a legacy? Legacy is inheritance. It's continuation. It's what someone leaves behind when they're gone. But what if the legacy isn't a fortune or property? What if it's something alive, breathing, hidden beneath the earth? The soldiers didn't understand at first. No one would. But when they climbed the cellar stairs and began exploring the house, each room, each object, each detail began assembling a puzzle so disturbing that some of them preferred not to look at the pieces. In the main room, covered by a cloth since the winter of 1847, 17 years before that day, there was a portrait. When one of the soldiers pulled back the dusty fabric, what appeared was the image of a woman seated at the piano, light-colored dress, her fingers resting on the keys like someone who had just finished a lullaby. Around her, for little girls, each holding a different colored satin ribbon, as if someone had wanted to mark their ages by colors. Blue for the oldest, pink for the second, yellow for the third, green for the youngest. That woman's name was Amelia. They said her voice was so pure it made the pine groves around the farm fall silent, as if nature itself stopped to listen. But the strangest thing about that portrait wasn't the beauty of the scene. It was the absence. The master of the house, Silas Ashby, owner of 1,600 acres of land and a reputation that mixed coldness with efficiency, didn't appear there. It was as if he had chosen not to exist in that memory, or as if someone had chosen to erase him. Silas Ashby believed in numbers more than God. Everyone knew that. He was the type of man who measured the value of things by their ability to be tallied, to fit into columns that closed perfectly at the end of the month. But something changed in the winter of 1847, the coldest winter in 20 years, when the irrigation pond froze over with ice, so thin it cracked at a touch, and the porch board snapped every dawn as if the house were complaining about the cold. It was that winter when Amelia disappeared. She didn't die. She didn't run away. She vanished. She simply stopped appearing at the table, stopped playing piano, stopped placing flowers in the hallway, stopped writing notes folded between the pages of psalms for her daughters. And Silas, without explaining anything to anyone, had the doors of the east wing nailed shut and covered the piano with a dark cloth. From that day forward, the farm breathed with 2 lungs. On one side, everything that glittered for visitors. On the other, the routine of ledgers, notebooks, and keys tied with twine to the master's belt. But here's the part that will make you wonder what really happened that winter. Before Amelia disappeared, the farm was struggling financially. Old debts, falling prices, fields exhausted by cotton. Silas had dismissed a gambling-addicted manager with a curt note and 2 witnesses. The property was on the brink of collapse. But from the end of 1847 onward, everything changed. Production rose. Debts began to ease. The lawyer Ambrose Talbot, a practical man and polished churchgoer, saw in the statements a financial health that didn't match the poor harvest of the neighbors. And at the same time, strange things began to happen. Catalog crates appeared in the attic. A new iron grate from a good blacksmith was bolted into the cellar masonry. And when a soldier years later examined that grate, he noticed something disturbing. The rust hadn't set in yet. It was as if the work were recent, as if someone had prepared that place to store something. Or someone. You're starting to understand, aren't you? Silas's sudden prosperity coincided exactly with Amelia's disappearance and the closing of the East Wing. And what if I told you that the notebooks found in Silas's desk revealed something that made even the soldiers most hardened by war feel a chill down their spines? Those leather notebooks, untitled, with small, firm lettering, contain a method that was easy to underestimate until you realize what it really meant. Silas didn't use names. He used field terms. Sapling for child, row for lot, bleeding for birth. He recorded heights, dentition, fever resistance, behavior under watch. He didn't write man or woman. He preferred sowing and harvest. The handwriting spoke of someone who wanted the future to behave like a field in straight rows, like livestock, like property. And those 23 children in the cellar, they weren't forgotten orphans. They were the product of a system Silas had created, a system that turned people into numbers, into investments, into legacy. If you believe stories like this should be told, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. The farm workers learned early to recognize the signs. When the lantern on the porch was tilted, flame turned low, it was medical visit night. A midwife would come from town on specific nights, sign simple receipts with initials, and discreetly receive a crate of provisions and kerosene. Silas's daughters, for girls who grew up with their mother's sweetness and manners, walked the hallway with poetry books in their hands and new ribbons in their hair. The servants whispered, when not under watchful eyes, that they were copies of Amelia, not Silas. But no one could prove it. No one dared ask, because questions in that house had a price. And Amelia's room? It was open only once years later, when a mason needed to examine the ceiling, because of leaks. He found the metronome stop on the piano, the lid closed, and a yellowed stain in the corner of the baseboard, irregularly shaped, a few inches from what could have been a drag mark. There was also a hymnal with a pressed pedal and a folded paper, dated from the day the house began using only one lung. The note said someone should take care of them, and mentioned switch names. A sentence no one fully understood, and that disappeared from the official inventory when the sheriff was called to investigate an unfounded rumor. The one who found that note was Louisa, the oldest daughter, at 12 years old. She tucked the paper in her apron pocket and didn't mention the matter at the table. She learned early that questions had a price. Now let me ask you something. What would you do if you discovered that your father, the man who was supposed to protect you, was cataloging human lives as if they were cotton crops? If you knew that the children locked in the cellar carried features of your own face, of your own mother? Louisa knew, and she carried that weight in silence for years. Field reports show, starting in 1849, a growth in available population with no purchases registered at auctions. Families in the quarters were reorganized. Couples were transferred to different sections of the same land. Children with no lineage began sleeping in a new wing of bunks in the cellar for safekeeping, according to a note on thick paper in the master's handwriting. On rainy days, water flooded the first 4 steps of the cellar, and the children woke with their skirt hems stuck to their shins. But no one came up, because locks are alphabets that don't accept accents. The old cook, Miriam, who had steady hands and a church voice, was given a small room near the east wing and ring keys, along with the task of carrying a tray covered with cloth into that part of the house always at dusk. One day, she accidentally knocked over a small amber cup and cleaned the floor before anyone could see. The bitter smell lingered until dawn. Miriam signed with the same M as the midwife's receipts. She knew, and she carried the secret to her grave. A brother of Amelia's appeared once, coming from Augusta, in a good hat and trim mustache, saying he wanted to hear the girls play. Silas received him on the porch with sufficient hospitality and promised a visit to town when the season permitted. The man left before sunset, without seeing his nieces. Later, he wrote 2 letters to the lawyer, family curiosities, and received polite, cold responses with a vague invitation to dinner when the river bridge was repaired. Between the lines of one thing and another, there was a silent admission that the farm functioned like an island where the rules of the outside world didn't apply. In the summer of 1852, a new overseer, Virgil Kane, took command of the fields. Kane was efficient and rough, kept the fields in line, liked to settle matters in front of everyone to teach safe paths. Silas used him like a cudgel that doesn't dull. It was Kane who one afternoon locked the inner gate of the cellar and left on the step, without seeing, a piece of twine with a triple knot. He kept a bundle of knots in his pocket to mark work memories. The boy who picked up the twine tied it around his wrist like a bracelet and, years later, would still smooth the knots with his thumb whenever he heard footsteps on the stairs. Among the girls in the cellar, a story circulated that if someone sang softly by the cistern wall, the water would return a song. It was a way the children invented to keep Amelia's memory without saying her name aloud. Can you imagine? Children growing up in darkness, inventing magic where there was nothing but cold stone and dirty water, because it was the only way not to forget that there once was light, that there once was music, that there once was someone who cared about them. And Silas? Silas walked through the entire house in silence whenever he encountered an object that reminded him of Amelia. Once, on an autumn Sunday, someone left a mother-of-pearl button from her dress on the sideboard in the living room. He picked it up with 2 fingers and stored it in the bottom drawer, the one that only opened when he was alone. What did that mean? Remorse? Longing? Or just the care of a man who kept evidence? With the new decade came news from outside. War on the horizon. Maps drawn with charcoal on crate lids. Names of places that seemed like stories told by tired people. A rider in a gray uniform passing through slept one night out back and spoke of the confusion in Tennessee, of how quickly news grew old. The next morning, someone swept footprints inside the fence like covering up a mistake. The house maintained its orderly appearance. Accounts stayed current, and Silas wrote with the same small lettering in the usual columns. But that same handwriting appears on papers no one should have seen. Lists of pairings with projected dates. A tree drawn with clean lines that didn't represent the past, but expectation. And Silas's daughters were listed under numbers, not names. Louisa noticed once that the number beside her name, in one of these drafts forgotten under an inkwell, matched the age she would turn that winter. She said nothing. But that night, she pushed her bed against the wall and stayed awake until the flame in the porch lantern reduced by half. She knew what it meant. She knew that the future her father was planning for her wasn't one where she would have a choice. The Quarters, by this time, had learned the geography of silences. A young woman named Rosa, who had a habit of twisting the hem of her skirt while thinking, tried to cross the fence at blue twilight and traveled 3 miles before the dogs made her return. She carried a small bundle, a pair of children's shoes that someone had left under the iron bed in the cellar, wrapped with blue ribbon that looked like it came from a prayer book. When they brought her back, Cain placed the bundle on the table without opening it, and Silas, without looking at Rosa, said that transfers solve confusions. The next morning, Rosa was no longer in the quarters. Miriam spilled milk while separating the cups and continued serving as if the milk had disappeared of its own accord. A week later, a carefully folded satin ribbon appeared in an iron box in the attic, tied with twine and a thick paper tag with a number that skipped others. The count in the house had its own logic. Throughout 1863, the rigidity increased. The old overseer, who had returned from the war limping, began patrolling the nights with a lantern and lingering at corridor corners, as if his legs demanded pause. In these delays, sometimes Silas's daughters heard the sound of cloth dragging on the floor, a recognizable sound, like that of an old party dress. Louisa, who had given up asking questions aloud, kept her own journal. She knew the time when Miriam left the tray in the east wing. She knew the sound of the larger key. She had memorized that the middle drawer always stuck when humidity rose. Once, when Silas needed to go to town to speak with Ambrose Talbot, Louisa entered the office with the steps of looking for a handkerchief and saw on the desk a light blue satin ribbon, folded and held by a paper tag. She recognized it immediately. It was one of the ribbons their mother used to put in their hair when they were still small, the same shade that appeared in the portrait in the living room. The end was worn, as if it had been used for years before being stored there, and beside it, Amelia's metronome, stopped at 6 beats. Louisa closed the door and left. She didn't take anything. That night, she passed a covered portrait in the hallway and adjusted by reflex the corner of the cloth that had slipped a bit. What would you do in her place? Confront your father? Run away? Or keep adjusting corners of cloth as if that were enough to keep the world in place? The longest day of that year was a simple day. Light rain in the morning, stopped at noon, returned in the afternoon. Silas ordered 2 lanterns lit on the porch before sunset because he was expecting a visitor. It was Sunday, and the vase in the hallway held dried magnolia branches. No one remembered the last time they'd seen water in that glass. The visitor came, as always, with a dark coat and leather briefcase, and left before dark closed in. Silas didn't have dinner. The sound of a chair scraping was heard in the office. Once, twice. At nightfall, he called his daughters to the room where the covered piano stood, lit the lanterns in a tone the girls recognized as warning, and placed on the table a small box that looked like a correspondence chest. He said the world outside was changing, and that no one would understand family stories, that things a house protects should remain under watch. The youngest, Clara, stared at the seam of the box with the attention one looks at ants and recognized the same pattern of the triple-knotted twine that Cain had forgotten months before. Louisa took a deep breath and placed her hand on the piano cloth without lifting it. Silas said that if necessary, he would do what was needed to preserve what was his. Do you understand what he was saying? He was willing to do anything, to keep the secret from leaving that house. News of a Confederate unit passing through the region, asking for provisions and horses, arrived in a hurry. Silas handed over 2 mares and sacks of corn. The men camped in the highest field, and that night talked like people who no longer have anything to hide from the cold. They spoke of Vicksburg, of Gettysburg, of a curved line drawn on the ground with a rifle, but one of them mentioned that the blue column wouldn't be long in crossing certain roads, and that, when it did, rusted gates would be the first to give way. The children in the cellar, who had been speaking quietly to each other for years, understood little. The idea of a column of another color was enough. By late winter, Silas seemed to sleep less. He went down twice a night, sometimes 3 times. Miriam passed with a tray earlier, left things wrapped in cloths, collected empty vials and a smell that tickled the nose, bitter like raw almond. The daughters, who already perceived that Sundays had a different measure than Wednesdays, began sleeping with their boots beside the bed. The metronome, though stopped, was heard by one of the girls one dawn, as if someone had touched it with a sleeve accidentally. It was enough for her to sit up in bed and count beats in the darkness, as if counting were safe. The night everything changed wasn't grand. It began with wind, continued with wind, and the sound of lanterns against glass made the house seem like a ship. Silas called his daughters to the living room and spoke quietly. He repeated that what was as needed to remain so. He opened the small chest and showed clear vials, well-fitted caps, the liquid swaying as if it had a life of its own. Louisa looked at the covered piano, thought of the metronome, and knew it wasn't a night for music. The crack that was heard came from the east wing. Miriam had dropped something or just bumped into a chair. The old overseer coughed in the hallway. Silas, with the box in his hands, said that if necessary, he would offer peace instead of shame. He didn't raise his voice. Perhaps that's why the footsteps heard on the stairs sounded like those of someone deciding what to do in a split second. Louisa moves forward. The accounts diverge here. She either grabs a box or knocks over the table. The vials hit the floor, one of them rolls, stopping near the piano cloth. One of the girls, the one who always arranged flowers, picks up the vial and closes it tightly, like someone wanted to keep air from entering. Silas, on impulse, tries to collect everything, but what he collects are papers that were under the box, the maps of the future, the straight lines, the numbers, the notes about fever resistance, good teeth, obedient temperament, the dates beside the switch names. This is family, he says, and someone from the hallway responds, whether Miriam, the overseer, or one of the girls, no one knows. That family isn't written with locks. What happened next depends on who's telling it. Some say there were screams. Others swear there weren't. That it was a silent urgency toward the porch, a breeze entering through the open door. 2 lanterns wobbling in a brief flash in a high field where, months before, the uniformed men had slept. What's certain is that the cellar doors were forced by hands that knew where to push, that the children climbed in silence with eyes trained not to meet the brightness, that the covered portrait seemed, in that instant, a window darker than all others. What's certain is that Silas's papers were scattered on the floor and trampled many times, and that Amelia's music box appeared fallen near the door, with a magnolia design scratched. What's certain is that the vials weren't counted. Silas's absence at dawn was treated by records as displacement caused by the disorder of the period. The town doctor, called days later, wrote the word interruption on a paper that was meant to be a decoration. The sheriff received lawyer Ambrose Talbot on the porch, the 2 speaking quietly, agreeing on terms that weren't exactly right. The daughters, taken to a distant aunt's house for a few weeks, returned to pack clothes and books, stored the ribbons in biscuit tins, and crossed the living room without looking at the portrait cloth. Louisa, before leaving, pushed open the door to the east wing with her shoulder and saw, for first time since childhood, the faded wallpaper, the rocking chair stopped, the piano with the same cover, and, on the windowsill, the empty glass vase that had once held gardenias. She placed in it, not knowing why, a triple-knotted piece of twine she found in her apron pocket. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It was the acknowledgement that those children existed, that they had names, that they mattered. When the war finally came down those roads with a column of another color, the men who broke down the cellar found the children and didn't find the owner. They found iron boxes in the attic with folded satin ribbons tied to numbered tags. They found notebooks in simple code. They found, in the office, a mother-of-pearl button in an empty drawer. They found in the cistern a fragment of light fabric caught in a brick crevice, and a piece of pottery, probably from a soup bowl that someone had used to tap the water's surface and hear the songs return. One of the soldiers, before closing the lid of the box where they would store the papers, touched the metronome, which beat 3 times and stopped, a small sound that seemed to push the air back toward the walls. Years later, in 1871, when a man drilled the ground searching for water, the bit broke through a wall and revealed bones in an old cavity. There was a magnolia-shaped brooch with a bent clasp and a thread of blue silk wrapped around a light-colored button. The doctor signed with tired handwriting, and the record used neutral words. The people who lived and worked on that land didn't comment, except with church sayings, things that needed to happen. The papers that survived ended up in a town hall cabinet and stayed there until someone, much later, looking for something else, found a never-sent letter with ink already pale, asking them not to confuse names. The ink failed at the end of the sentence, as if the pen nib had scratched the paper being pulled away quickly. The house, over time, collapsed from within. The cloth over the portrait gathered the smell of dust and mold, and the boards creaked with the wind as before. The piano remained closed. The metronome, those who returned their say, still rests on the lid, pointing to a number no one chose. The vase with dried branches is on the hallway floor, leaning against the wall with a chipped rim. It's impossible to say who chipped it, and the cellar, which once held 23 children without sun, now breathes with the same air as the open ground. The iron grate fell long ago, and on the step where once someone lost a knot of twine, there's a dark stain that seems to have been left by the sole of a wet boot. No one knows whose. No one needs to. Those who pass by without knowing the story see only a piece of old iron, an empty vase, the silence of piano. Those who know avoid stomping their feet hard so as not to wake any sound that time decided to spare. Because some stories don't end when the doors open. They keep echoing in the walls and forgotten objects, in knots of twine tied by children who only wanted to remember that someone once cared. And you, who heard all of this to the end, what do you think? Did Silas disappear because he fled? Or because someone decided that certain legacies don't deserve to continue? Leave your answer, because this story, just like those children, deserves to be remembered